The evening my furnace quit, I thought it was just another lousy Tuesday. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table since around 5, drinking decaf I didn't really want, watching the November sky go dark through the window above the sink. My wife had been gone 3 years by then, 3 years, and I still made 2 cups sometimes without thinking. That kitchen had a way of making the silence louder than it needed to be. The furnace had been making a sound for about a week. Not a bad sound exactly. More like a tired one, a low rattle, like something loose knocking around inside the unit. I kept telling myself I'd call somebody. I kept not calling. When it finally stopped running altogether around 7 that evening, the house didn't get cold right away. It just got quiet in a different way. I put on an extra sweater, found the number for a repair company my neighbor Dot had used the previous winter, and left a message. Then I sat back down at the table and thought about my son. Donovan had called that afternoon. He called most weeks now, which was new. For a long time after his mother passed, we barely spoke. He had his reasons, or thought he did, and I had my grief, and neither of us knew how to reach across the distance that had grown between us. But lately he called. He asked how I was eating. He asked about the house. He had started asking about the house a lot. Donovan is 51. He has his mother's eyes and my stubbornness, and a wife named Kelly, who I have never been able to read. When Ruth Ann was alive, she used to say Kelly was managing us. I thought that was too harsh. Now I wasn't so sure. The house is worth a good deal. I know that because a realtor sent an unsolicited letter last spring telling me so, with a number that made me read it twice. Ruth Ann and I bought it in 1987 for what now seems like an amount of money you'd spend on a used car. The neighborhood changed. The values climbed. We stayed. I never thought much about what would happen to it after I was gone. That's the honest truth. Ruth Ann and I had a will drawn up years ago. Simple as they come. Everything split between Donovan and his younger sister, Faye. Faye lived in Portland and taught high school chemistry and never once asked me about the house or the accounts or any of it. She called on Sundays to ask how I was sleeping. I was thinking about all of this when the furnace repair company called back. Not a recording, an actual person. A younger man who said his name was Gil and that he could come by first thing in the morning. We set it for 8. I went to bed wearing socks for the first time since I could remember. Gil showed up at 7:45, which I respected. He was maybe 35 with the kind of quiet competence that meant he didn't need to explain everything he was doing. He looked at the furnace for about 20 minutes, came back upstairs, and sat down across from me at the kitchen table the way a doctor sits down when he has something to tell you. He said the heat exchanger had a crack in it. He said it had been leaking carbon monoxide into the house slowly, for some time. He said that based on what he was seeing, he didn't know how I hadn't noticed symptoms, headaches, dizziness, confusion. I told him I'd had headaches for months. I thought it was stress. He looked at me steadily. He said, "Sir, you need to not sleep in this house tonight until this is replaced. I'm serious about that." I thanked him and wrote him a check and sat there after he left. Carbon monoxide. Colorless, odorless, accumulates while you sleep. Kills people who never see it coming. I thought about the crack in the heat exchanger. I thought about how long it had been making that rattling sound. I thought about Donovan asking me, just 3 weeks earlier, if I'd had the furnace serviced recently. I told him I hadn't gotten around to it. He said, "Dad, you really should. Those old units can go without warning." He had seemed almost urgent about it. At the time, I thought he was being considerate. I went and got the calendar off the wall, the one from the hardware store that I'd been using for 40 years, and I looked back. The rattling had started around the time Donovan visited in September. He'd been in the basement doing what he said was checking for water damage near the water heater. I hadn't thought anything of it. He'd been down there maybe 20 minutes. I sat with that for a long time. I want to be careful here, because I know what it sounds like. A man starts suspecting his own son, and suddenly everything looks like evidence. I've lived long enough to know that's a dangerous kind of thinking. But I've also lived long enough to know when something doesn't sit right in my chest, and something was not sitting right. I called my doctor and made an appointment for the following week. Then I called my attorney, a man named Burl who had handled our estate work for over a decade, and told him I wanted to come in and talk. He said Thursday worked. I did not call Donovan. I drove to a hardware store and bought a carbon monoxide detector, 2 of them, and a small digital thermometer, and a notebook. Then I drove to a motel on Route 9 and paid cash for 2 nights and sat on the edge of the bed with the television off, thinking, here is what I knew. I was 67 years old. I lived alone. My house was worth somewhere north of $600,000. My son had recently become very interested in my well-being in a way that felt different from love, though I couldn't entirely have said why. And the furnace in my basement had a cracked heat exchanger that was leaking a gas that kills people quietly, in their sleep, with no warning and no struggle, and nothing that looks like anything other than natural causes. I thought about Ruth Ann. I thought about what she would say. I knew exactly what she would say. She would say, be sure before you do anything. But don't wait until you're too sure. I bought a cheat notebook and started writing things down. Dates, conversations, the September visit, the questions about the house, a comment Donovan had made in October about whether I'd thought about moving somewhere easier to manage, a moment at Thanksgiving when I'd overheard him and Kelly talking in the hallway and stopped when they heard me coming, both of them turning with the same too wide smile. Thursday came and I went to see Burl. He was 70 himself, white-haired, with the kind of face that had heard too many difficult things to be surprised by any of them. I told him everything. I told him about Gil's diagnosis of the furnace. I told him about the September visit. I told him what I'd been feeling, and I told him I wasn't certain, and I told him I might be a paranoid old man reading the wrong story into ordinary events. He listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd always liked about him. Then he said, "Let me ask you something. If you're wrong about all of this, what happens if you change your will?" I said, "Nothing. Donovan gets less than he expected, and I feel foolish." He said, "And if you're right, and you don't change it?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Burl drafted a new will that afternoon. Faye would receive the house and the primary accounts. A modest sum went to Donovan, enough that it wouldn't look like a punishment, enough that a challenge would likely fail. The rest went to a small scholarship fund Ruth Ann had always wanted to establish at the community college where she'd taken classes when she was young. I signed it. Burl notarized it. We shook hands. He said, "I'm also going to refer you to someone." The someone was a man named Alderton, who described himself as a private investigator, but seemed more like a retired detective who had kept his network intact and his overhead low. He had an office above a dry cleaner and a handshake that meant something. I told him what I told Burl, and he didn't raise an eyebrow. He said he'd look into a few things quietly. I went back to the motel. I called a heating company, a different one this time, and had the furnace replaced entirely. 2 days later, I moved back home. I put the CO detectors in the basement, the bedroom, and the hallway. I started sleeping with my door cracked and the window open a 1/4 inch. Donovan called that Friday. He asked how I was doing. I said fine. He asked if anything was new. I said no, just the usual. He asked with a casualness that wasn't quite casual if I'd thought any more about getting the house appraised. "Just so you have the number," he said, "for planning purposes." I said I hadn't thought about it much. He said, "Kelly knows a realtor, really well reviewed." I said I'd keep that in mind. After I hung up, I sat in Ruth Ann's chair in the living room, the one I never sat in, the good one by the window, and I talked to her the way I had gotten used to doing since she'd been gone. Not out loud, mostly, just in the way you carry someone in your head. I told her I didn't know if I was right. I told her I hoped I was wrong. I told her that hoping you're wrong about your own son is one of the stranger experiences a person can have. Alderton called 2 weeks later and asked if he could come by. He sat in the living room with his coat still on because he said he didn't plan to stay long. He put a manila folder on the coffee table. He didn't open it right away. He told me that Donovan and Kelly had been in contact with a real estate attorney in early October, several weeks before the furnace started making its noise. They had discussed, in what the attorney apparently believed was a hypothetical scenario, the process of transferring property out of an estate in cases where the owner was incapacitated or deceased. The attorney, to his credit, had told them he didn't handle that kind of work. and suggested they speak to a probate specialist. Alderton opened the folder. There was a printout, some notes, a copy of an email chain that I didn't ask him how he'd obtained. He told me there was more. He told me that Donovan had, over the past 8 months, taken out a personal loan of $34,000 using a lender that specialized in what Alderton called anticipation lending, loans structured around expected inheritances. The terms were steep. The debt was real. The collateral, on paper, was Donovan's projected inheritance from the family estate. I looked at the papers for a long time. My hands were steady. I was surprised by that. Alderton said he wanted to be careful about words like intent. And he said that nothing he had found was proof of a crime. He said the furnace situation might have been exactly what it appeared to be on the surface, a failing unit in an old house. He said he had found no direct evidence that Donovan had tampered with anything. Then he said, "But I think you were right to be careful." I thanked him and paid his invoice. After he left, I sat in that chair again for a while. I want to say I cried. I think a person in a movie would cry at this point. I felt something else instead, a kind of flat, empty clarity, like when you've been dreading a diagnosis for months, and then it comes and part of you almost feels settled, because at least now you know the shape of the thing. My son had, at minimum, been circling the idea of my death as a financial event, whether or not he'd touched that furnace. He had sat across from a lawyer and discussed the mechanics of inheriting my house. He had borrowed money against my death. He had called me every week asking how I was feeling. I thought about what I wanted to do. I thought about it for several days. I did not call the police. I had no proof of a crime, and I wasn't going to report my son for something I couldn't demonstrate what I had done. Changing the will, fixing the furnace, documenting everything, keeping my own counsel, felt like the right kind of response to what I actually knew versus what I feared. I called Faye. I hadn't told her anything yet, and I hadn't been sure I would. But she had a right to know. She came down from Portland on a Friday evening and sat at my kitchen table and listened the way her mother used to listen, without interrupting, with her hands folded in front of her. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, very simply, "What do you need from me?" I said I needed her to know the whole picture. She stayed the weekend. We talked about her mother. We watched an old movie on Saturday night that none of us had seen since the kids were small, and she laughed in the same places Ruth Ann used to laugh, which was hard and also good. When she left Sunday afternoon, she hugged me at the door for a long time. She said, "Call me more." I said I would. I meant it. The following spring, Donovan called to tell me he and Kelly were having financial trouble. He didn't get into specifics, but he asked, with the same studied casualness, whether I might be willing to advance him some of his inheritance. He said it like that. His inheritance. Like it was already decided. I told him I was sorry to hear things were difficult. I told him I wasn't in a position to advance anything because I'd made changes to the estate structure that made early distributions complicated. I kept my voice neutral. I watched myself from a little distance, the way you do when you're being careful. He asked what changes I meant. I said that Burrell had suggested some restructuring for tax purposes, and that it was all fairly technical. I said I'd have Burrell send over a summary if he wanted. He didn't push. He got off the phone a few minutes later. Burrell sent nothing because there was nothing to send. The will was what it was. Donovan wouldn't know that until he needed to. I'm not going to pretend that some part of me didn't grieve for what that phone call meant, for what had clearly been going on in my son's head for longer than I wanted to think about. You raise a child and you watch him grow into a person, and somewhere in there you lose track of when exactly the person he became stopped resembling the boy you thought you knew. I don't know when that happened with Donovan. I don't know if it was something I did, or something Kelly brought out in him, or something that was always there and just needed the right circumstances to show itself. I probably never will. What I know is this. I woke up this spring and the house was still mine, and the air inside it was clean. I've been taking walks in the morning now. There's a woman named Opal who walks the same loop most days. She moved into the house on the corner after her husband passed, which was about 6 months after Ruth Ann. We started walking together by accident and then kept doing it on purpose. She makes very good coffee and has opinions about everything and laughs easily, which is something I had forgotten to look for in a person. I don't think about Donovan every day anymore. Some weeks I go several days without it crossing my mind. That feels like progress, or close to it. Bay calls on Sundays. Lately we've started talking longer. The tulips Ruth Ann planted along the back fence came up again this year without anyone doing anything. They just came up, orange and yellow, exactly the way she'd planted them, right on schedule, unbothered by everything that had happened in the house behind them. I stood at the kitchen window one morning and looked at them for a long time. I thought, she knew what she was doing when she planted those. She always did.